So thank you everybody for joining us at this ACEN webinar, our first one for 2022. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all based across the country today. So for me, that's the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. I'd like to acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to their country, and I respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and their cultural beliefs. I'm pleased today to introduce Anne Hewitt and Craig Cameron to speak to us on their work on managing the risks of WIL students. I do just want to let everybody know that their project report is available on the ACEN website, so you will be able to see that along with the recording at the end today. So with that, I'm going to mute my video and hand over to Anne and Craig. Thank you.
Before we begin with the nuts and bolts of our presentation, I'd like to extend an apology to you all for the slightly late start, which was entirely my fault and all about Zoom deciding it hated me. I know it's an experience you will all have shared, so I'm sure you can extend me sympathy, but I'm currently registered using my personal address because apparently I don't exist in my professional capacity.
And would you be able to just share your screen and we can get straight into the game plan for today, because time is limited. I know for everybody. Okay, so topic for today, I'm just going to get rid of our faces from the screen, is managing the risk of WIL studentships, which is part of a 2020 ACEN research project. Thanks, Anne.
I'm sorry that I just have to find the little buttons. There we are.
There it is. So the game plan for today, we'll do a very brief overview of our project. As Sharon's already mentioned, the final report is available for public access, and we've provided a link to that both in the invitation as well as the slides today. Then Anne will take you on a risk management 101 for those that are incredibly literate in risk management. Anne will be preaching to the converted. For those that don't have that same experience in risk management, her 5-minute explanation will be very, very helpful. Then we move into really the final part of the report that we did, looking at risk management actions for the design of what we describe as studentships, and I'll define that shortly. And I'll also define what we consider to be risk management to be. And then there is 5 minutes of Q&A. We may go over that. We have no problem. Anne and I with answering your questions. And if we don't have the time to answer your questions, feel free. I think there's the ability, Sharon, and I'm not a Zoom aficionado, I'm a Teams person, but there may be an opportunity to write questions in the message chat box. Yes. And if we don't get to the answer to those questions, keep those questions coming throughout the presentation. But if we don't get to them, no worries, we will respond to you in a prompt manner. All right, thanks, Anne. So research context, what brought Anne and I together to explore this concept of studentships? Well, we both come from the general labour law field. Anne's a specialist in equal opportunity, anti-discrimination laws, whereas I've done a little bit around risk management and skills development and work integrated learning research in general. And we identified some issues in our separate studies dealing with scholarships in particular. For me, it was the potential for scholarships to be used as a way to circumvent the obligations on a host or employer to remunerate their employees. And I saw some of the hazards associated with scholarships. Anne took the angle of an access to WIL issue that providing non-remunerative financial support to students can assist students complete work integrated learning opportunities, and not providing that financial support can detract from that access. So what we wanted to do was deepen our understanding about the concept of non-remunerative, in other words, non-wage payments made to students for undertaking WIL. We didn't come up with the name studentships. We actually took it off some of the US and English schemes dealing with what they consider to be studentships. Thanks, Anne. There's our report. Feel free to grab a link to that report. That's also available in the invitation for today's session.
And anyone who wants to tweet or LinkedIn link, we love you.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, feel free to connect. Absolutely. So definitions, so that we're all singing from the same song sheet today. Work integrated learning, we define as 3 key elements. 1, it's a curriculum design. 2, it involves 3 parties. It's a tripartite relationship: the student, the university, and an entity hosting the student. And 3, it's actually part of an individual course within a program. So it's a program requirement to complete work integrated learning, or it's part of a course of study. Okay, so it's what separates work integrated learning from what we consider to be just work experience. Risk, very broad definition. Think of any issue in the way that you interact with work integrated learning, which can impact the delivery of WIL. In the case of studentships, we're looking at any issue that impacts studentships. And it's a dual perspective. And we will provide those slides, absolutely. Sharon, I'm sure they can be available sometime during or at the end of the presentation. Risk management, pretty much actions designed to maximise the opportunities and minimise the risks, minimise the hazards, in this case, dealing with studentships. Now, this term studentship we use. What we wanted to do, similar to work integrated learning, is to have some kind of umbrella term that we can use to describe any kind of non-remunerative, so non-wage financial support provided to a student in the context of WIL studentships to complete WIL. So that financial support could be simply deposit money in bank to student, or it can be an in-kind payment. Could be vouchers. We've seen WIL studentships where the university, as the donor, provides program fee waivers, the provision of travel cards, reimbursement for accommodation or living expenses. Okay, so anything which is non-wage, non-remunerative, which provides financial support to a student to complete WIL. Now, some of the audience members today may be familiar with the concept of studentships in the context of a research project that a student might do during a break in the teaching period. They're also described as studentships in the United States as well as UK, but we thought, given it's not used too often in Australia or New Zealand, the Asia Pacific, that we would kind of take that term to describe any non-remunerative financial support. Right, thanks, Anne. Project stages, really briefly. We did a literature review to identify any gaps in the literature dealing with WIL studentships, in particular risk and risk management. That then led to a multi-method study. First, a web-based study of WIL studentships, so basically scraping the data predominantly from university websites about studentships. The studentships can be scholarships, they're also termed bursaries, grants, etc., and then analyse that data. The second strand of that multi-method study was an interview-based study of WIL studentships. So we went out into the virtual field, given the restrictions with COVID, didn't have any face-to-face interviews. We spoke to a number of university stakeholders, so risk and legal personnel, managers of work integrated learning programs, as well as those on the ground at the coalface, delivering work integrated learning in conjunction with these studentships, and looked at the risks and risk management issues around WIL studentships. We also spoke to students as well, so around 12 or 13 students across 4 states and territories. And with all of this data, we analysed it and came up with a risk management framework. So a series of principles that stakeholders can use to maximise the opportunities and minimise the hazards associated with provision of financial support for students to complete WIL. Thanks, Anne. And Anne, over to you to discuss risk.
Thank you. So, as Craig said, risks in the way that we were examining them could be positive or negative. But there were effectively 3 component parts. So it was any issue, event, or circumstance which could arise in the context of a WIL studentship. The likelihood that that situation would occur, and an evaluation of the consequences if it did. So it was effectively a identification of what might be over the horizon, how likely it is to land in front of us, and what would that mean. I'm sorry, I now have the chat sitting in front of the slides, so I'm going to move that around. Risk management takes that process of identification of what risks might be out there and engages in 4 steps. So identification of the risks, that evaluation of their likelihood of happening and the severity of the consequences if they did happen. A determination about what action will be taken in response to that potential risk, and then also a process of evaluation to determine whether all the risks have been identified, whether they've been appropriately triaged and that assessment is accurate, whether the actions are appropriate, so that the risk management framework can be refined as required. And those 4 elements were all used in the definition of risk management that we used in our report. So I'm going to very briefly take you through those steps and try and explain how our report can be useful in undertaking them in the context of your WIL engagement, your institution, and the WIL studentships that you might be associated with or aware of. So the first step is identifying the risks that might be relevant. There are some broad risks in this space, but many are also contextual, so that it will depend on your institution, the disciplines areas in which you work, the nature of the WIL arrangements and WIL studentships with which you are working. So both the literature review that we did and those empirical research methodologies, I think, can facilitate developing an awareness of potential risks that could arise. But also there may be others that are unique to an institution or discipline area, cultural context, even to legal quirks within a particular jurisdiction. So identifying the particular risks for your situation. The second step is to assess that risk. And as I said, there's a number of components here. First, working out whether that risk, and remembering that risk broadly defined could be positive or negative. Having Craig is the risk management expert within our partnership, and I often intuitively interpret risk as danger. But in this context, it could also mean opportunity. So you could be evaluating the likelihood that something very positive will occur, or the likelihood that a hazard will eventuate. And triaging whether it is extremely likely to occur, so almost certain, or very unlikely. And then evaluating what the consequences will be if that risk, positive or negative, does actually eventuate. Now, in this situation, in terms of risk management, I think many of us will focus on the hazards rather than the opportunities, because I think that we probably are more prepared to welcome the lotto win with open arms than the student who is injured in the course of a placement. So we probably will naturally focus on the negative, but I do want to emphasize that this matrix can apply to the positive as well. And once you have those 2 pieces of evaluation, how likely is the risk to occur? And what are the consequences if it does? You can work those together into an institutional specific risk matrix. So this will be a triaging tool for working out what kind of action is appropriate for any particular risk in the context of that institution, that discipline, that WIL studentship. Having developed that triaging tool, then that risk matrix becomes the basis for determining what risk management actions are appropriate. And here there is a wide spectrum that is possible. Everything from deciding that the risk is too extreme so that it is inappropriate to try and manage it, and instead the activity should be avoided altogether, to accepting the risk, implementing no action to minimize or address it, and continuing anyway because the opportunity is greater than any identified hazard, and that with everything in between. So from attempts to eliminate or control the risk, to try and minimize it, or to transfer it to another party through the design, structure, and management of the things giving rise to the risk. And then, as I said, to create a virtuous regulatory circle, this process should continually be evaluated. So risks, both in their likelihood to eventuate, but also the possible outcomes if they do happen, will change. The risks that could occur and what the consequences of those things are will modify throughout time. I think that that is something that we're all particularly attuned to in 2022, having come through 2 years of a pandemic, which I don't think really anyone saw coming. So the process of evaluation and ensuring that your risk matrix is still fit for purpose and you are identifying appropriately, triaging and responding to the risks is critical. Our report can assist with that. So it will give information about both the potential risks that might be out there and some of the risk management actions that could be taken in response to those risks. We also had a number of recommendations broad recommendations about risk management, which perhaps can be taken across many institutional contexts. And I'll turn this back to Craig.
Thanks, Anne. So for the remainder of this presentation, before we move into the question and answer session, we're just going to provide a summary of some of the key actions that can be taken around two aspects of the WIL studentship, both the initial design of this WIL studentship and then the delivery of that WIL studentship, which Anne will touch on some recommendations there. So we have a number of recommendations in the report. I think we have something like 29 risk management actions and about 11 separate recommendations. We're not going to do a blow-by-blow description of all of those recommendations and actions today. Feel free to peruse the report, and if you have any queries, don't hesitate to contact us through the appropriate email channels or on LinkedIn, and we'll provide our email details at the end of this session. So why do we set up these actions? Simply put, for those stakeholders that are interested in evaluating their existing studentship programs. Now, not all of these risk management actions are going to apply to your specific studentship program, but it will give you an indication of, yep, we're on the right track with our WIL studentship design and delivery, or wow, there's a few actions here that we could incorporate to maximise the opportunities and minimise some of the hazards concerning WIL studentships. And then there's another stakeholder group interested in setting up these studentships. So there's a fair amount of interest here around giving students financial support to access work integrated learning opportunities, particularly from equity groups. So here's kind of an initial template that can be used to say, well, these are the things that we have to be concerned with. Hazards, these are the things that we can potentially implement in our design, which can maximise the opportunities of the WIL studentship. So I'm just going to touch on 10 of those risk management actions in terms of the design. The first one, and this is particularly relevant to Australian work integrated learning programs. New Zealand has a different, and I know I've got some friends across the ditch that are listening today, and very warm welcome to you. There are different legal systems dealing with the issue of work integrated learning under labour law. In the Australian context, having work integrated learning as an essential term of the studentship. So it's something that the student has to do as a condition of receiving their financial support is really important to minimise labour law risks in an Australian context. So in Australia, we have the Fair Work Act, and there's what's known as a carve-out provision in the Fair Work Act dealing with the vocational placement exemption. If you can make the studentship part of a work integrated learning program and it's compulsory, you're effectively breaking a nexus between the receipt of money and the performance of work. And hopefully people can see my hands. I can't see myself as I'm presenting. Hopefully this works, but you got that on the spectrum. What work integrated learning can do is kind of break that nexus, which would otherwise form an employment contract. So we saw a lot of WIL studentships that said, oh, you could do X course, or you could do an internship, which is recognised by the university. But if you don't do it, you just do plain work experience, then you're opening up the door to a potential Fair Work Act action. And I do have some material on the New Zealand position, Claire. So very important point, New Zealand, different recognition of work integrated learning under their labour laws, similar to the United States. The second risk management action is about documenting. It's really important that you document the terms of the studentship, not just the work integrated learning experience. It's got to be and the WIL studentship. What we've learned quite recently from a High Court decision in Australia is that the courts are going to interpret the written terms of the contract dealing with the studentship strictly. So what's written is what's going to be the rights and obligations of the parties. So making sure that you get that document right, for example, in collaboration with risk and legal personnel, is very, very important to managing risk. Number three there.
Can I just add one proviso to that, which is that the court also emphasised they don't care what you call the relationship. You can't craft it to be a non-employment relationship by labelling it as that. They're actually going to look at the nuts and bolts of the obligations and duties stipulated in the contract rather than the terminology adopted.
Yeah, that's a great point. You can call an orange an apple, but it's an orange. So they're going to look at the substance of that contract, the rights and obligations of the parties in the written document. Really, really important. The third risk management action deals with review. So it's really important, particularly at the initial design stage, to review the accessibility of studentships. So one tip that we have is start with making the studentship accessible to all students. Start at that premise and then have a rationale, have a reasoning for excluding student groups. Why are you excluding student groups? That's not a bad thing. It's just it's something to consider. Are you excluding postgraduate students and including only undergraduate students? What about international students? We found that many WIL studentships excluded international students. Why? Students who don't receive a relevant ATAR or GPA, why are they excluded? Now, there might be good reasons to exclude them, but having that rationale is really, really important as part of your strategy for setting up your WIL studentship. Should be restricted to just full-time students. Why are we excluding part-time students? Those types of questions need to be asked at the initial design stage. Number 4 is around devise a strategy. So actually have a strategy for the WIL studentship, which is more than just, we will provide financial support for students. So which students are you going to target? Which industries? Which academic disciplines? Which geographical areas could be specifically targeted? One thing that we noticed is that some of the WIL studentships, they had a strategy, but it wasn't aligned with the eligibility and selection criteria. So I'll give you an example. There was a WIL studentship which was targeted at students of financial and educational disadvantage. Fantastic, great strategy. Yet academic performance, along with financial need, was a selection criterion. So students were selected on the basis of not only their need, but also their academic performance. Now, students may not be performing academically because, well, they're in financial need. And studies, plenty of them, have found that provision of financial support actually improves academic performance. So having that, what we call strategic alignment. The strategy, why are you doing it? with the eligibility and selection criteria. Risk management action number 5, specify the terms for the use of WIL studentship payments. That's important to reduce some of the legal risks. So actually making it clear what are the type of expenses that are going to be used, what are the types of items going to be used by the student as part of their financial support. So is it clearly for additional accommodation, living, and travel expenses? Is it for the purchase of particular equipment? Because if you make those terms specified and even mandated, that's going to minimise some of the legal risks associated with the court saying, hey, this is not, these payments are actually remunerative. They're actually part of an employment relationship. They're not part of a specific studentship. Thanks, Anne. Okay, 5 more risk management actions to go before we look at the delivery of the WIL studentship. Make conditions attached to the WIL studentship accessible to students before submitting the application. So we saw a number of WIL studentships that didn't make it absolutely clear before the application stage how students were going to be selected, the process of selection, and any conditions attached to the WIL studentship once it was received by the student. So for example, did they have to participate in promotion on behalf of the donor, turn up to events? Did they have to do a reflection on their work integrated learning experience, which could be published? That raised some intellectual property issues. So being transparent is, I think, an important risk management action in WIL studentship design when it comes to any conditions that the students must satisfy. Devise strategies for minimising the risk that the WIL studentship is remuneration. So we've talked already a little bit about the labour law risk. One key risk management strategy there is have donors, those that are providing funding, that aren't host organisations, that are not taking the students on the work integrated learning experience. Clearly that breaks that chain or that nexus between the provision of the funding and any work that the student may perform during their work integrated learning experience. And making sure that the funding use is not connected to the idea of an exchange of work for money. So is the funding for additional accommodation, living and travel expenses? One way to completely avoid the risk is simply, well, not simply, asking the host organisation, if they're the donor, to perhaps enter into a separate employment contract with the student instead of or in addition to any studentship payment that the student receives. Consider incorporating flexibility in payment scales based on student circumstances to maximise impact. So we all know that universities are very poor at the moment, and we need to demonstrate maximum bang for our buck. So rather than have, say, 3 studentships of $5,000 each, perhaps pool the studentship funds of $15,000, for example, but then have scales. Could be $500, $1,000, or $1,500 based on financial need or educational disadvantage. So you're aligning your strategy to the payments, but you're also giving more students access to studentship funds, i.e. more bang for your buck. The second last action there, review eligibility criteria that enable or restrict students' access to multiple WIL studentships. So we saw a number of schemes where a condition was that the student could not or has not received studentship funding in the past. Now, we understand why that rule may be there, to ensure that students who have not previously received studentships get access to a scheme, but there are a lot of disciplines out there where there is more than just one WIL experience that they have to do. Think of education, think of health, for example. Students don't lose their financial need after completing after just one WIL studentship. They might have a financial need to complete a second WIL experience, which is a compulsory part of their course. So I think one needs to tread carefully about a blanket restriction on the ability to access multiple WIL studentships. And then finally, review the restrictions on the timing of WIL studentship applications. So we saw a number of WIL studentships which had a very, and that might be appropriate, have a very rigid scheme that you can't obtain WIL studentship funds after the event, after you've completed a WIL experience or during a WIL experience. And that can be problematic, particularly for students who are in financial need. They might be in financial need during their WIL placement, or they may have racked up a very large bill as a result of the WIL experience at the end of the WIL placement. So thinking about flexibility, enabling students perhaps to apply for a studentship before, during, and or after the WIL experience. Thanks, Anne, over to you.
Thank you. So Craig addressed a number of the things that you can do when designing the WIL studentship. And I just wanted to briefly address some of the things that you could do in the management of the WIL studentship. So once it's actually up and running. The first one is to develop a system to actually review your WIL studentships. So to check how they have been designed and how they're being run, to triage for risks and to minimise that if possible. So that, I think, has two component parts. Well, perhaps three. The first is that obviously every time a new WIL studentship is created or an existing WIL studentship is amended, that would trigger some kind of review to identify any hazards and opportunities flowing out of it, and to respond accordingly to try and maximise the opportunities while minimising the hazards. So new WIL studentships and amendments to existing WIL studentships, both I think are a trigger moment for that to happen. But also because things do change, both the law changes, the environment changes, our student cohorts change, many things operate around us. So I think also a regular review of existing studentships, even if they're not changing, can be critical. But developing a risk management system in itself isn't sufficient. It needs to be a risk management system which is adequately resourced. And particularly during our interviews, we found we got a lot of feedback about this, that it had to be an accessible system and a system in which people could get expert assistance as required. So many of the individuals within universities that we spoke to were extremely aware that there were, for instance, labour law risks attached to WIL studentships, but they were a discipline expert rather than a legal expert and were ill-equipped to identify and respond to the particular risks of the WIL studentships with which they were associated. So there needs to be both human capacity in terms of a system which is accessible and streamlined and efficient, and expertise, but also financial support to develop and maintain an effective risk management system. Another thing that we identified in the course of the research was that in many instances, and this was flagged by Craig, there wasn't a very good communication strategy for students about the WIL studentships that were available. This arose in a number of different ways. It may be that there was limited information about the purpose and eligibility criteria for the WIL studentship, or that the WIL studentship was advertised only when it became available and there was limited information about studentships that may be available in the future that would facilitate students engaging in planning. We thought there were a number of consequences from that, which students we spoke to confirmed. One is that if students aren't aware that a studentship is out there, they won't apply. But also if there's any lack of clarity, either about eligibility or about the documentation that might be required to actually make a documentation, make an application, then students might be dissuaded from actually going through the process, which undermines the utility of it for students, but also for the other stakeholders, for universities who want to support individuals to undertake these experiences, and for the donors and hosts who would like to brand themselves as good corporate citizens to support the next generation, perhaps to attract excellent talent into their organisation and have the opportunity to develop those relationships. So that was one management strategy, which we did want to flag. Another one is to educate the stakeholders, particularly donors and hosts, about the risks associated with WIL studentships and the parameters about design and delivery that can be undertaken to minimise those. Because many studentships weren't just offered by a university, there were multiple stakeholders here, whether perhaps a donor who may also be a WIL host and a university and a student, having a broad understanding of why particular designs may be preferable to others and why particular management strategies were appropriate, facilitated everyone to be on the same page and ensured that the potential conflict or confusion was minimised as the WIL studentship progressed, and that the opportunities for benefit from all parties were maximised. Another thing that we identified was that, as Craig said, considering a diverse range of studentships, so identifying all those discipline areas and student groups who may need assistance to access WIL, and devising a strategy to ensure that there is a broad range of studentships available to cater to those particular areas of need. There are a number of strategies that could be undertaken to do that. One was evaluating areas of need and then reconsidering existing studentship arrangements to see if they're addressing the right priorities. Another one was to try and find more funding effectively. That sounds a bit crass, but we identified a surprising number of individual and charitable organisations funding WIL studentships. There were also quite a few paid for by the host who was actually going to take the student on, but that was by no means the majority. So thinking broadly about where sponsorship can come from to try and cater for niche groups. And then finally, making sure that there's an effective communication strategy in place. Now, this was one area where it seemed that things very often went wrong. That while a studentship may have been designed and implemented, there wasn't a clear communication strategy to ensure that information got to students, to donors, and to hosts in a transparent way. And this often left academics who were perhaps discipline experts but hadn't been involved in the creation of a WIL studentship trying to triage things. So we thought that that was an aspect of WIL studentship management that should be considered early and a strategy implemented. So how will the communication be effectively managed? Would a studentship manager be appointed? Would there be a particular person with a relationship with a particular donor who would triage the issues with them? So what was the communication strategy and how could it be made most effective? So those are some of the management ideas arising out of the literature review, the interviews with students, and our interviews with university staff. So that concludes our analysis of these select risk management actions and recommendations. There are more in the report, but I think if we've introduced you to some, perhaps it's time for us to throw this open and to ask you guys for questions. However, Sharon, I did wonder if it would be appropriate to pause the recording during the questioning section of today's session, because I know that many people want to identify issues about particular studentships and may not want the details of the arrangements they're discussing to be recorded.
Absolutely, Anne, and I will go ahead and pause it. So look, thank you, Anne and Craig, for your presentation. I think that was a really insightful presentation, and I think you've given us all inspiration to go and fully read the report on the ACEN website. And I'm sure that colleagues here will take advantage of you sharing your emails and your LinkedIn profiles to kind of connect in with you. Thank you so much for your time today. That was a fantastic webinar. We had really great engagement. And I do just want to make a note that the ACEN conference is being held in Melbourne in October this year. And for those of you who may not yet be registered, look, jump on the ACEN website for more details about the conference. We'd love to see you there if you can make it. It'll be great to be able to get back in person and actually chat through some of these issues with one-to-one and in groups. So look, just encourage you to remember that the conference is on this year. We will have a full schedule of ACEN webinars coming up throughout the year, so stay tuned on the website for information about that. And just again, finally, Anne and Craig, thank you so much for your time today. Very much appreciated having you join us to share your research. And with that, I will stop the recording and see you all at the next webinar you're attending.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you everyone.